moving to the legal aspects, and we have online from Cairo, Professor Mohamed Helal. Professor Mohamed Helal, he is the legal counsel, Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Egypt. He's an associate professor of law at Ohio State University in the United States. He is also, as I said, associate, not assistant. And he is also affiliated faculty member of the Marathon Center for International Security Studies. He is specialized in public international law, included UN law, the law of the sea, and the law of non-navigational uses of international water courses. Published in many leading peer-reviewed journals, including the European Journal of International Law, Climate Law, the American Journal of International Law. Was a lecturer on law at Harvard Law School, where he obtained his SGD and LLM degrees. Taught international criminal law as a visiting assistant professor at that time at the Section Français of Ain Shams University, Faculty of Law, and taught international human rights law at the American University in Cairo. And recently, Professor Helal appointed to the Permanent Court of Arbitration in the Hague. We would like also to congratulate you, Professor Helal, for this new position. So we will hand over to you online for the legal negotiations on the GERD.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hani, Dr. Hisham, and the organizers of the Cairo Water Week. I would have been delighted to join you in the conference center. However, unfortunately, due to health reasons, I continue to be in quarantine. I will be very brief. I realize that a significant amount of time has passed since these panels began, so I'm sure our audience are exhausted. So I'm going to make 5 points relating to the political and strategic setting of these negotiations. And then I'm going to make 5 points regarding the legal aspects of the ongoing negotiations on the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. So let me start with my comments relating to the political and strategic situation relating to the dam. And particularly, I would like to highlight the main or foundational principles that have governed Egypt's approach in these negotiations. And in particular, first and foremost, Egypt has been driven in these negotiations by its recognition of Ethiopia's right to development and Ethiopia's right to utilize the shared water resources of which both countries are co-riparians. And this is predicated on Egypt's commitment to the principle of the community of interest. For us, we realize and understand and uphold the principle that a shared water resource is not to be monopolized by any riparian state. Rather, it is a shared water resource that is predicated on common ownership and a community of interests. And so Egypt has what I think is an unwavering political commitment to reach an agreement on the GERD that recognizes Ethiopia's right to development, recognizes Ethiopia's right to utilize the Blue Nile, and to achieve a return on its massive investment in the GERD. On the other hand, like any agreement, the GERD agreement should be based on a quid pro quo. It is an exchange of interests and an exchange of benefits between the three riparian states. And so while Egypt is going to do anything and everything necessary to support Ethiopia's right to development, the other side of the coin, the other side of this exchange is the necessity to ensure that the GERD agreement protects downstream states from the adverse impacts of this dam. So the objective here is to enable Ethiopia to generate hydropower as expeditiously and sustainably as possible, while also preserving the equities, rights of downstream states and preventing the infliction of significant harm on their water interests and their riparian rights. So that's the first really foundational tenet of Egypt's position. It is a political commitment to reach an agreement that is fair, that recognizes Ethiopia's right to development while also minimizing the downstream impacts of the GERD. Second, Egypt is committed to the principles of burden sharing and benefit sharing. To us, that is the foundation of this agreement. It's an agreement that should be based on enabling the three countries to share the burden of introducing this mega dam into the Eastern Nile system, and also to share the burden of adjusting to the changing hydrological conditions. And of course, on the flip side, is that the three countries should be able to share the benefits of this project. Obviously, there would be an increased storage capacity in the Eastern Nile system. There would also be an increased capacity to generate hydropower in the Eastern Nile system. These are benefits that should be shared, but also the burdens that would be created by introducing this very large dam into the Eastern Nile system should also be shared. From our perspective, achieving that objective of a burden sharing and benefit sharing agreement could have been achieved through a multi-reservoir operation that would connect the Aswan High Dam and the GERD, and that would establish the foundation of a deep collaborative relationship between these two countries. Or we could have had a relationship based on multi-layered drought mitigation measures. That would also have provided the basis for deep cooperation and coordination between the Aswan High Dam and the GERD. Unfortunately, as we stand at the moment, we have not yet found that our colleagues and brothers and sisters in Ethiopia have been willing to adopt an approach based on burden sharing and benefit sharing. We have not found that the idea of applying a multi-reservoir operation in the Eastern Nile has been amenable to them. We have also found that they've not been open to applying a multi-layered drought mitigation mechanism. So overall, the purpose of these negotiations, for us at least, is to optimize the system, is to ensure that this dam is operated at an optimal level while also minimizing downstream harm, and therefore to optimize, to have an optimal agreement or an agreement that optimizes the operation of the system as a whole, which would enable the three countries to achieve greater water security. Third, our perspective and our approach has been principled and pragmatic. And to be specific here, we have to be honest and we have to be clear that we all recognize that there are significant divergences between Egypt and Ethiopia regarding the overall management of the Nile basin. And to be more specific, we all realize that from Ethiopia's perspective, that the most effective mechanism to manage this system would be through the Cooperative Framework Agreement, otherwise known as the CFA. As I'm sure many in the audience understand, the CFA is not an agreement that enjoys consensual support by the Nile Basin riparian states. Egypt, Sudan, South Sudan, Burundi, the Democratic Republic of Congo. These are just some examples of the countries that have not yet fully supported the CFA and have not fully supported that agreement through ratifying it. And so from our perspective, we are not going to be able to settle all of our differences on the management of the Nile system in these negotiations in the GERD. Therefore, our approach was to try to be pragmatic and practical. We wanted to be pragmatic by focusing on issues that can be solved and by focusing on matters on which we can reach an agreement, which is the filling and operation of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. In other words, from a legal perspective, we are not seeking an agreement that establishes a comprehensive or broad regime for the Nile. Rather, we are seeking to reach an agreement on a single dam, a single project on a single tributary of the Nile River system. And from our perspective, that is a practical approach that tries to build confidence between the three countries, that establishes a joint coordination mechanism that includes the three countries, which would build a relationship of trust and a relationship of cooperation between the three countries that would hopefully help us to overcome our long-standing differences on the methods or the most optimal methods of managing the Nile Basin system. Unfortunately, what we have found in the negotiation is that Ethiopia has been hoping to settle all of our differences on the management of the Nile Basin through the GERD agreement. And to be more specific, we have found that Ethiopia has been insistent that the GERD agreement has to be connected to the CFA, and that if Egypt and Sudan do not accept the CFA, that Ethiopia would not be willing to conclude a long-term agreement on the GERD. From our perspective, that is an unconstructive position and a position that is not conducive to building the relationship of trust and the relationship of confidence that can ensure the sustainable application of an agreement on the GERD. Fourth, because we understand that there are significant differences and divergences on how to manage the Nile Basin system, we are seeking an agreement that preserves the equities of the three countries and that does not prejudice their legal positions on the long-term issues. And let me be more specific. We all understand that Ethiopia has reservations about the 1959 Nile Waters Agreement. I'm sure everybody in the audience realizes this. And it's been a long-standing position that has been taken by Ethiopia. And so our approach in these negotiations has been very clear. Divisive issues such as the CFA or problematic questions such as the status of the 1959 agreement should be put to a side. We are not going to be able to find a conclusive solution to these issues in these negotiations on the GERD. And so from a legal perspective, what we need to find is to be able to put those issues aside. In other words, to cabin them, to put them to one side and make sure that the three countries are not prejudiced on any of these issues. In other words, that Egypt's position, Ethiopia's position, and Sudan's positions on all of these issues would be preserved and would be maintained and would not be prejudiced through the GERD negotiations. We believe that this was a constructive attitude, a practical attitude. It was a pragmatic approach that would have enabled us to reach an agreement that is only specific to the GERD without affecting the broader issues or without implicating the broader issues that continue to undermine comprehensive cooperation in the Nile Basin system. My final point regarding the overall approach or the political and strategic approach to these negotiations is that we were approaching or we were seeking to reach a dynamic agreement. And here I'm thinking of the comments made by Professor Biswas, which I think were really spot on. We were not seeking an agreement that would be written in stone and that would be unchangeable. From our perspective, we need a dynamic agreement that is based on an adaptive and cooperative approach to the filling and operation of the GERD. An agreement that is adaptive to the changing hydrological conditions and that is cooperative in the sense that it builds the institutional and legal infrastructure that would enable the three countries to cooperatively alter their filling and operation methods and that they would be able to cooperatively adapt to changing conditions. But moreover, our understanding of a dynamic agreement was even broader than an adaptive and cooperative filling and operation of the GERD. We were very careful to include in virtually every proposal that Egypt has presented, we presented proposals on the periodic review and the periodic amendment of any agreement on the GERD. The purpose of this review would be to take into consideration changing hydrological conditions, the impact of climate change, the impact of future Ethiopian uses. Egypt was careful to include in any agreement on the GERD provisions that would guarantee that Ethiopia would undertake future uses, that would not foreclose Ethiopia's right to undertake future uses, as long as those future uses were undertaken in a cooperative and coordinated manner and in accordance with the applicable rules of international law. And we were very clear that we were more than prepared. We were willing to review any agreement on the GERD so as to introduce future uses into the Eastern Nile system. From our perspective, these 5 points that I have highlighted are an application of the general rules of international law that are applicable and that govern this negotiation. These general rules, which are codified in the 2015 Agreement on Declaration of Principles, which is a treaty concluded by the 3 countries, these principles, primarily the principle of equitable and reasonable utilization and the obligation to prevent the infliction of significant harm, are being applied through these general principles. And let me give you several examples. So, for example, when we think of the principles of equitable use and the prohibition on the infliction of significant harm, our models and our proposals and our approach to this agreement was based on applying these 2 principles by optimizing the operation of the 2 main hydropower facilities in the Eastern Nile system, which are the GERD and the High Aswan Dam. Our models were based on a desire to utilize the resilience of the HAD, or the High Aswan Dam, to enable the GERD to fill and operate as expeditiously and sustainably as possible. Our models as well were not based on simply what the Egypt water share as codified in the 1959 agreement. Rather, they were based in accordance with international law on the existing uses. And the existing uses are much higher than 55.5. Egypt's existing water uses are well above 80 billion cubic meters annually. And the question of impact was based on trying to minimize the impact on those water uses and to minimize the socioeconomic and environmental effects of the GERD. As Dr. Hisham explained, this is a multiplier model. It's a model based on how affecting the water flow will also have socioeconomic, environmental, ecological effects. It will affect seawater intrusion. It will affect the salinity of the delta. So these are all issues that are included in our models. It's not a simple issue of water balance or mass balance in the system. And we believe this is we think it's a sophisticated approach to applying the law. It is a clear mechanism by which we try to give effect to the obligation of equitable use, which takes into consideration existing uses. We are often surprised that our colleagues in Ethiopia refer to the principle of equitable use as though it gives license to ignore existing uses. It is clearly mentioned in the Agreement on Declaration of Principles and in the 1997 Water Courses Convention that existing uses, current uses, are part of the equation of what determines equitable use. And so from our perspective, the equitable utilization of the Blue Nile would require us to achieve an optimization agreement that enables us to generate hydropower from the GERD expeditiously and sustainably, while also minimizing and mitigating the effects on downstream states, including through having a robust drought mitigation mechanism. And there are multiple ways we can do that. Dr. Hisham already explained 3 options that we proposed and that our models included, which include a multi-reservoir operation, the circuit breaker, and the multi-layer drought mitigation mechanism. However, ultimately, as they say, it takes 2 to tango, and it requires political will on the part of our upstream core riparians to be able to accept the concept that this is a river that is co-owned and that we need to reach an optimal benefit sharing and burden sharing agreement. So these are sort of my 5 general comments that are of more of a political and strategic nature. Moving on to my 5 comments regarding the legal issues that we are dealing with in these negotiations and perhaps the points of divergence in these negotiations. So first and foremost, it may surprise many of you in the audience that the 3 countries continue to have different perspectives on the binding nature of the document we are negotiating. Of course, some of you may be surprised because you may think after 10 years of negotiating, have you not yet agreed on the nature of the document? And unfortunately, that is the reality that we are at the moment. For Egypt, and I would say also for Sudan, the objective here is to reach a binding agreement. For Egypt, that means we are negotiating a treaty that is binding under international law and that is governed by the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties. We think that is, a commonsensical approach, an approach that preserves the rights of the three countries. Unfortunately, we have not found that our colleagues in Ethiopia have been forthcoming on this point. In fact, we have not even yet agreed, or there continues to be disagreement on the title of the document. Egypt has proposed to call the document an agreement on the filling and operation of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. Our colleagues in Ethiopia continue to want to call it guidelines and rules on the filling and operation of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. Of course, we are not, this is an issue that continues to be the subject of negotiations. And for us, Egypt has shown a lot of flexibility on this point and has provided multiple solutions for this issue, as long as ultimately this is a treaty. It is governed by international law and is governed by the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties. The second issue that has been problematic in these negotiations, and which I have already touched upon, is the relationship between the GERD agreement and previous agreements, including the CFA and the 1959 Nile Waters Agreement. As I said earlier, our approach in these negotiations has been to put those issues to one side. And there are many different ways that we as lawyers can find solutions for this. In other words, if there is a problematic issue, a divisive issue, a point of contention between the parties, there are mechanisms which can be used and language that we put into the treaty that puts those issues to a side and preserves the positions of the three countries on those points. Unfortunately, our colleagues in Ethiopia have not been open for this. For example, for Ethiopia has insisted to include in this agreement, which is only on the GERD, to include text that would say that Egypt and Sudan would be required to join the CFA. Moreover, Ethiopia insists on having language that says that this agreement is not to be a recognition of the 1959 Nile Waters Agreement. From our position, we have said very clearly that Ethiopia and Sudan and Egypt are not bound by any agreements to which they are not party. We feel this is a commonsensical and a straightforward position that is really a logical position to have, and it is in accordance with international law in the sense of, if a country is not a party to an agreement, obviously it is not bound by that agreement. And so there's no need to specifically identify a particular treaty, because that would create legal problems for other countries. So from our perspective, it was not appropriate to specifically mention the 1959 agreement. It is not appropriate to specifically mention the CFA, but rather that all the countries are not bound by agreements that they are not party to. So that is the second legal issue that we continue to have problems with. The third issue relates to unilateral adjustments. And the problem here is this. Our colleagues and sisters and brothers in Ethiopia continue to insist that any agreement on the GERD can be altered and adjusted unilaterally by Ethiopia at any point in time. To explain this further, and I'm sure many of you in the audience are engineers and experts on this matter, our colleagues in Ethiopia have insisted that the quantiles included in this agreement and the values denoting the different drought thresholds, and also all the different numbers, which I assume would also include the filling schedule, that would also include the normal operational rule, that would include the route curve for the operation of the GERD. Virtually every component of this agreement can be unilaterally adjusted by Ethiopia at any time, and they would only be required to inform downstream states. As a lawyer, of course, this would be very difficult for Egypt to accept, because this is what I call a hydrological blank check. Egypt would be signing an agreement that basically signs away its rights and its equities in the Nile system. And so from our perspective, and maybe again, I'm going back to what Dr. Biswas was explaining about the dynamic agreement. A dynamic agreement is an agreement that is amended through negotiation. It is reviewed periodically through a process of consultations so that the three countries are able to reach an equitable result. And not only that, let me share with you a very important piece of information that shows you and that confirms Egypt's goodwill. We have also proposed a mechanism, an institutionalized mechanism of amending and updating this agreement. We realize that there is a lack of trust in the system. We realize that there is a historical baggage that is sometimes preventing these countries from reaching a mutually beneficial agreement. And so we proposed that if the countries fail to find an agreement on the review of the document, if the three countries fail to agree on amendments to take into consideration changing hydrological conditions or changing climatic conditions or changing demographic or social factors or whatever any other reason that may require a review of the technical specifications of this agreement, we were willing to introduce a fourth party, in other words, a mediator that would come in and that would help us reach a review, that would help us undertake the review of the agreement and reach understandings on how we can alter the technical aspects of the agreement to take into consideration the changing conditions in the Eastern Nile system. Unfortunately, none of this was acceptable to our colleagues in Ethiopia. They continue to insist on a unilateral right to change virtually every aspect of the agreement, including the hydrological, the quantiles based on the historical time series, including obviously any of the other technical specifications regarding the filling, the drought mitigation measures, the drought thresholds, the water levels at the GERD, and the amount of support to downstream states. So virtually every technical aspect of this agreement would be subject to unilateral alteration. We believe that's not palatable to downstream states, and it's not possible for downstream states to accept an agreement of that nature. Another matter relates to future development works, which I have already touched upon. Our perspective is that this agreement should not foreclose Ethiopia's right to future developments. And in fact, we included language that reaffirms Ethiopia's right to undertaking future developments in accordance with the applicable principles of international law, which are included in customary international law, but that are also codified in the 2015 Agreement on Declaration of Principles. And we also argued that future development projects should not prejudice the agreement on the GERD, and that if we need to alter the agreement on the GERD to take into consideration future development projects, we would be more than glad to do so. And going back to my earlier point, we would be glad to include a mediator to help us revisit and revise and rewrite the GERD agreement to take into consideration future development projects. Again, it's unfortunate that our colleagues in Ethiopia have not been open to these proposals. They continue to insist on an unlimited, unrestricted right to undertake future development projects. In fact, and some of you may know this in the audience, our colleagues in Ethiopia have started proposing during the latest rounds of negotiations that are being conducted under the auspices of the African Union. The proposals they presented lately include language that says that this agreement is not the threshold of significant harm. And I would always tell my colleagues in Ethiopia, this turns the whole agreement into an empty shell. It removes all value. So you're basically telling me that we're going to agree on a particular threshold and a particular definition of prolonged drought, but you're also telling me that Ethiopia retains the right to change that threshold and that definition and the support mechanisms at any point in time. And Ethiopia will also not consider these thresholds and numbers and support levels to constitute the threshold of significant harm. So I always ask them, what's the point of the agreement? I mean, why would we sign the agreement? There is no incentive for Egypt to ever sign an agreement of that nature. So the final legal issue that I would like to point to is the dispute resolution mechanism. Again, for us, this is an agreement that needs to be robust. It needs to be effective to protect the interests of all three sides. This is not a dispute resolution mechanism that is aimed at Ethiopia. It is aimed at all three countries to ensure the effective implementation and execution and compliance with this agreement. And so there continues to be a divergence of views on that point. Egypt has proposed arbitration through the Permanent Court of Arbitration or through other mechanisms or through other appointing authorities, including the World Bank. Unfortunately, our colleagues in Ethiopia are insistent that any dispute resolution mechanism should be limited to negotiation between the parties, which we feel is not particularly effective and would not provide a conclusive solution to any disputes or any differences that may arise in the future. To conclude on this, as Dr. Hani and Dr. Hisham, my good friends and colleagues, have explained, ultimately at this point, we have reached a point where the missing element really is the political will. I think the science is clear, the hydrology is clear, the issue that we have before us really is a lack of political will to reach an agreement that is based on burden sharing and benefit sharing that enables us to have an optimized management of the Blue Nile system, and that has an optimized management of the GERD while minimizing its effects on downstream states. We have definitely, we continue to be committed to negotiations. I mean, to put it bluntly and clearly, we have not given up. We have not given up hope. We continue to be committed to this process being led by the African Union and by the Republic of South Africa as the current chair of the AU. And hopefully we can find a solution. I mean, during the negotiations in Washington were very difficult. They were very arduous. They were incredibly exhausting. But ultimately, we did reach a document. Unfortunately, our colleagues in Ethiopia walked away from this process, but we are hopeful that this African Union process can bridge the many gaps and the many divergences between our three countries. I'm going to stop here. I thank you for your time, and I thank you for participating in the Cairo Water Week, and I thank Dr. Hani for moderating this session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mohammed. We really wish you a speedy recovery, and we would love to see you here in the room and maybe also in another meetings. I think with this, we will come almost to the end of this session, but we will open questions for anyone in the room, or also we have received some questions from our audience online. I just got this paper yesterday. It's published on the 16th of October 2020, so the day before yesterday, just confirming what Dr. Hisham was presenting, even the numbers. And Kevin Wheeler, I assume he is hearing us now, one of the very good scientists who published many papers on the GERD, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. And this is almost saying and confirming the technicalities that were presented today. So you can see also here the dotted line. This is what's going to happen for the High Aswan Dam when the Ethiopian dam started to be filled, and the orange one is the Ethiopian dam, and the dotted one is without GERD, and the line, the continuous black line, is with the GERD. So there is a difference without and with, because some people are saying you already were able to go through the 80s drought without losses in Egypt. Today, if the 80s drought happen again, the situation will be different, and this is confirmed in this paper. Please read it, because today Sudan is abstracting more water than the 80s, and here you can see the assumption or the calculations is saying Egypt might have deficit of minimum 84 billion cubic meter if the dam is filled according to this non-cooperative. And you can see the impact. Even the drought is going to, the impact on the deficit in Egypt is going to start 2 years earlier than without the GERD. But I'm happy that Kevin Wheeler will have a session in the Cairo Water Week, so please attend it. This will be organized by SIWI. I'm not sure when, but of course it is in the program. I would like also to thank him. He's one of the good scientists who is neutral, who's tried to help the three countries technically. So I opened the questions. I handed over already 2 nice questions coming online to Dr. Hisham, so please go ahead. I also, if you allow me, I will start by international speakers. They might would like to leave us. So I have only one question to Peter. I'm not sure whether he's still with us. The question is coming from Dr. Siddiq Aisa Ahmed from the UNESCO Chair in Water Resources in Khartoum, Sudan. He's saying, can you elaborate more on the 6 thematic modules for the checklist on the development of legal framework for transboundary water cooperation? I'm not sure whether Peter is still with us.
Yes, I am still here, listening very good. Interesting presentations. And if I catch the question with the elaboration of international agreements on water management. And this work is undergo in the frame of the Water Convention of the UNECE. And we would like to develop a very practical tool, just a kind of shopping list. What are the main features which the international agreement should contain? This knowledge will be collected in this kind of handbook. So I hope we are just trying to collect, let's say, the main important parts of the existing agreements all over the world. And I think we can deliver a very interesting publication later on. So the process is ongoing, and hopefully we will deliver this new instrument also by the end of next year. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much. I have another point and question to Elko van Peek. The question is saying also from Dr. Siddiq, technical issues and proposals on dams operation look nice and convincing. What about countries' commitments? And it goes further and saying, what about the international laws and the enforcement? In other words, what about the UN agreement on transboundary rivers for non-navigation purposes, 1997?
Yes, indeed. What I presented were the technical details, but from various other speakers, it is not so much the technical detail that determines the outcome, but it is about the political, the total legal and institutional setting that decides upon what is possible, what is not possible. So I support the remark that this should be taken into account.
Okay. I give the microphone to Dr. Hisham so to give feedback on the couple of questions he received online.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Hani, for the floor. Actually, I have received a couple of questions. The first question comes from Ahmed Gamal. It says, how far the wet period in which we live now could decrease the tension among the negotiated countries? Well, this is a very good question. Actually, in all our proposals, we are dealing with the matter in a stochastic and probabilistic way, during which you have examined all the different hydrological condition, either wet, average, or dry period. And accordingly, we have set the rules that deal with each categories of the hydrology. So for instance, if we experienced wet hydrology, and according to what we have offered, is Ethiopia can accelerate filling as there is excess water in the system, so we can get advantage of the wet period by accelerating the wet, which give some actually incentive for the upstream countries also to get benefit from the wet period. If the other way around, there will be a mitigation to do this. So in all the measures that we have been put, we are considering the whole range of the flow, either wet, average, or dry. I hope this answers your question. The second question is also coming from Engineer Ahmed, is saying, is there an expected change in the rainfall pattern in Ethiopian plateau? Actually, there is some changes in the rainfall pattern, but in order to say there will be a rainfall pattern change, this has to be monitored and evaluated on a very long period, which is not available right now. So I cannot say there is a rainfall pattern change or not, but maybe adding a huge water storage like GERD will impact the circulation of water. This is definitely will occur, but how much, how will be, this is definitely has to be monitored and studied over a long period, which is typically for the issue that's related to the climate change. The third question coming from Engineer Abdurrahman, do we have an EIA for the GERD project? Actually, the TNC, which is the committee that's conducted between the three countries, was hired two international consultants, which is BRL and Artelia, to do two major studies, one related to the water resource, and the second is relating to the TISIA, which is Transboundary Environmental Social Impact Assessment as for the downstream. Unfortunately, these studies was not finished. Only the inception report were generated, and the 9 ministers from the three countries signed a letter for the consultants to continue. Unfortunately, this letter was not sent from the head of this of the TNC at that time, which is Ethiopia. So unfortunately, there is no shared transboundary EIA for the GERD project. However, there are several attempts from independent researchers to trying to account for this question. The last questions coming from my colleague, Dr. Rawia. She is asking about how we are dealing with the significant impact of GERD and how we transfer this with the farmers, and how are you informing them about the potential impact of GERD. Actually, as from my capacity as an academic position, we are publishing a lot of papers that is tackle the issue of the GERD with the different potential impacts, and also there are several issues that have been dealing with that in the media. So this is informing the different stakeholders. Also, I'm not in the position to talk about on behalf of the ministry, but the Ministry of Water Resources have been dealing a lot of this matter with information transfer and knowledge base, and also this is just the regular routine of the Ministry of Water Resources and Irrigation. You may know that Egypt is one of the highest water efficiency. We are using the water 3 times. We are using with the overall efficiency that's more than 85%, and we are even working more on, or the ministry is working more on irrigation improvement and etc. So all these there are several tracks carrying all these aspects. And the last question is, what does Egypt plan B in case of deadlock? Well, we will, as my colleague Dr. Mohammed said, we are always optimistic to have an agreement with negotiation with our brothers. If there will be a deadlock, from the technical perspective, we are working on that. However, if there will be a deadlock or something, I just assure you, all the country organization are aware very much and taking care with these conditions very well. This is the last question, Dr. Hani. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hisham. Do we have any questions in the room? I think you are tired. Do we have any further comments from our panelists online? Would you like to add anything? If not, I would like to thank our panelists, Professor Bisaus, Dr. Passon, Mr. Peter Kovacs, Dr. Elko van Peek, Professor Hisham Bekhit, Professor Mohamed Helal, and thank all of you for your attention. Sorry for some technical issues. We're out of our hands. We tried our best. And I thank you very much for the Ministry of Water Resources, His Excellency Dr. Abdelati, Dr. Iman, Dr. Amr Fauzi, and all the people who organized this event and insisted to organize Cairo Water Week 3. I think that's what makes Cairo Water Week stronger, to insist on continue, because it's becoming, and I see abroad that people start to speak about Cairo Water Week, and I'm sure it's going to be always improving and always better. Now we have Corona, but next year, inshallah, it will be better for Cairo Water 4. I thank you all and enjoy your break. Thank you.